In 1954, a teacher in Ohio could hang a wooden paddle on the wall in plain sight, and no parent would think to complain. Down the hall, children practiced hiding under their desks from a nuclear bomb. This was an ordinary Tuesday. Today, nearly every one of these things would trigger lawsuits, headlines, and emergency school board meetings. Number 8 on this list was something the government injected into millions of kids right there in the gymnasium. And number 1 was so accepted that it took the Supreme Court to even begin to end it. These were the everyday realities of American schools in the 1950s. Before we start, hit subscribe, because some of these will make you grateful for the school you grew up in. Let's count down 30 things from the 1950s that would shock students today. Number 30. The glass milk bottle and the milk monitor opened the morning in almost every elementary school. Long before cardboard cartons, milk arrived in heavy glass bottles, delivered in wire crates. The cream still settled at the top. A child was chosen each week as milk monitor, trusted to carry the crate from room to room and set a cold bottle on every desk. For a few cents a bottle, subsidized under the federal milk program that fed millions of children, every student drank whole milk whether they wanted to or not. The clink of glass on wooden desks, the paper cap punched with a thumb, these were the textures of a school day. A child now would be baffled by glass bottles in a room full of running kids and by the idea that drinking milk was simply not optional. Number 29. Inkwells and dip pens turned penmanship into a daily ordeal. Carved into the top corner of nearly every wooden desk was a round hole, and into it sat a small ceramic well of liquid ink. Students wrote with steel-nibbed pens dipped again and again, learning to manage the flow so the page did not blot. A pen pressed too hard splattered, a pen left too long dripped. The infamous prank of dipping a girl's braid into the inkwell behind her was real enough to fill countless memoirs. Ballpoint pens were spreading fast by the early 1950s, but many schools clung to dip pens as proper training. A modern student raised on keyboards and touchscreens would not last an afternoon. Number 28. The Palmer method made handwriting a subject in its own right. Children did not simply learn to write, they were drilled hour after hour in a rigid national system of cursive that prized uniformity above all. Rows of looping ovals filled practice sheets, the whole arm moving from the shoulder rather than the fingers, exactly as the manual demanded. Teachers walked the aisles correcting posture and grip. A child whose letters slanted wrong did the page again. Good penmanship was treated as a window into good character, and report cards graded it separately. Students today, whose cursive is often barely taught at all, would find the sheer devotion to handwriting almost unbelievable. Number 27th, the mimeograph machine gave the classroom its unmistakable smell. Before photocopiers, teachers reproduced quizzes by hand, cranking a drum wrapped in a stencil, pulling out page after page, printed in soft purple ink. Children pressed the fresh sheets to their faces to breathe in the sharp, sweet chemical aroma, a scent an entire generation would remember for life. The teacher's fingertips were stained, the master copy slowly wearing thin. It was slow, messy, and limited, 100 copies before the stencil gave out. To a student now, used to instant printing and shared files, the idea of an adult cranking a machine by hand to make 20 smudged purple worksheets would seem almost charmingly primitive. Number 26. The slide rule was the only calculator a student in the 1950s would ever touch. There were no electronic calculators in classrooms, none at all, and so older students learned to multiply, divide, and find square roots by sliding a precisely marked ruler against a center scale. It hung from belts and leather cases like a badge of seriousness. Mastering it took weeks of practice, lining up the cursor, reading the marks, and estimating the decimal place by hand because the rule never told you. The men who designed the rockets of that era did their figures this way. A modern teenager who solves the same problem in a half second on a phone would be stunned that an entire generation of mathematics ran on a ruler and the human mind alone. Number 25. Heat came from a coal furnace or a pot-belly stove, and comfort was a matter of luck. In countless older and rural schools, a single iron stove in the corner fought the winter, fed by a janitor or sometimes the teacher herself before dawn. Children nearest the stove roasted, while those by the windows shivered in their coats. The smell of coal smoke clung to wool sweaters, and the bucket of ash by the door was emptied daily. There was no thermostat, no even warmth, only the glow of the fire and the drafts that crept under the door. A student today who adjusts a room with a complaint to the office would be amazed that warmth itself once depended on a fire someone tended by hand. Number 24. Air conditioning did not exist in the schoolhouse, and the heat was simply endured. When spring turned to summer, classrooms became ovens. Tall windows were cranked open in hope of a breeze, and a few ceiling fans pushed the thick air in slow circles. Children fanned themselves with their workbooks, collars damp, ink smearing under sweating hands. In much of the South, the school year was shaped around the heat and the harvest as much as anything else. There was no relief, only the long afternoon and the buzzing of flies against the glass. Modern students, who expect a controlled climate and protest when a unit fails, would be astonished that generations sat through June in a sweltering room and counted it normal. Number 23. The outhouse, not the indoor bathroom, served countless rural schools well into the 1950s. In small town and country districts, indoor plumbing had not yet arrived, and so behind the schoolhouse stood two wooden privies, one for boys and one for girls. A trip to the bathroom in January meant pulling on a coat and crossing the frozen yard. The smell in summer, the cold in winter, the splinters and spiders were all part of the day. A bucket and dipper near the door provided water for washing. To a student now, raised with clean, tiled restrooms, steps from the classroom, the idea of walking out into the snow to an unheated wooden shack would seem like something from another century. Number 22. The one-room schoolhouse still taught the whole town under a single roof. Though they were fading fast, tens of thousands survived into the 1950s, especially across the rural West and Midwest. A single teacher, often young and unmarried, managed every grade at once, from 6-year-olds learning letters to teenagers working through algebra. Older children helped teach the younger ones. Lessons were recited aloud at the front, while the rest worked in silence. The teacher swept the floor, lit the stove, and rang the handbell that called the children in from the yard. A modern student, used to a school of hundreds sorted by age into separate rooms, would struggle to imagine learning long division beside a child still learning to read. Number 21. The lice check and the school nurse's inspection were a routine public ritual. On certain mornings, the nurse moved down the rows with a comb and a bright light. She parted hair, peered at scalps, and checked necks and fingernails. A child found with lice was sent home in front of everyone, sometimes with a note pinned to the coat. Heads were checked for ringworm, throats for infection. In an age before many vaccines and antibiotics, the school was a front line of public health, and privacy was not part of the bargain. The shame of being pulled aside in front of classmates was its own punishment. A student today, protected by privacy rules and quiet nurse visits, would be shocked at how openly a child's body was inspected before the whole room. Number 20. Shared water and the common dipper lingered far longer than anyone now would believe. While modern fountains were spreading in the cities, plenty of older schools still kept a water bucket with a single tin dipper that every child drank from in turn. Even where fountains existed, the understanding of germs was loose, and children pressed their lips to the same spout without a second thought. The teacher refilled the bucket from the pump in the yard. In the South, of course, water fountains carried a far darker division we will come to later. To a student now, handed an individual bottle and taught never to share a straw, the image of an entire class drinking from one metal cup would seem unthinkable. Number 19. The playground was a field of asphalt, concrete, and bare steel, built without a thought for soft landings. Tall metal slides baked in the sun until they could burn the backs of a child's legs. Seesaws slammed down onto packed dirt. Merry-go-rounds spun fast enough to fling the careless rider into the gravel. Monkey bars rose over hard ground with not a wood chip or rubber mat in sight. Skinned knees, split lips, and broken arms were treated as the ordinary cost of recess. Supervision was light, and risk was simply part of growing up. A student now, raised on padded surfaces and constant oversight, would be stunned by how dangerous the simple act of playing once was. Number 18. Girls were forbidden from wearing pants, no matter the weather. The dress code in schools in the 1950s was strict and absolute. Girls wore dresses or skirts every single day, even when snow drifted against the windows. Some wore slacks under their skirts on the worst mornings, only to peel them off the moment they arrived. Hemlines were measured. Hair was expected to be neat, shoes polished, blouses tucked. The idea that a girl might attend class in jeans was not merely against the rules, it was unthinkable. A modern student, free to dress in comfort and self-expression, would find it hard to grasp a world where a girl could be sent home for the simple act of wearing pants in winter. Number 17. Left-handed children were forced to write with their right hands, often harshly. Teachers of the era widely believed that left-handedness was a flaw to be corrected, even a sign of weakness. A child who reached for the pen with the wrong hand had it taken away and pressed into the other. Some had the left hand tied down or wrapped with a ruler each time it crept back to the page. The result, for many, was a lifetime of cramped handwriting and a quiet sense of having been made to feel broken. Oral histories are full of adults who still remember the sting. A student today whose left hand is simply accepted would be appalled that a child's natural way of writing was treated as something to beat out of them. Number 16, home economics for the girls and shop class for the boys divided the school by gender as a matter of course. There was no choice in it. Girls were marched off to learn cooking and sewing, sometimes baking biscuits for a grade, while boys went to the workshop to handle saws, lathes, and engines. The lessons were openly preparing girls to be homemakers and boys to be earners. A girl who wanted to learn woodworking or a boy who wanted to cook simply could not. The future was assigned at birth and reinforced in the schedule. A modern student who chooses electives freely would be stunned that the school itself once decided your whole life based on whether you were a boy or a girl. Number 15, prayer and Bible reading opened the school day in classrooms across the country. Before the Supreme Court rulings of the 1960s, daily devotion was a normal and expected part of public education. The teacher led the class in prayer, read a passage of scripture aloud, and the children bowed their heads regardless of what faith their families held. A child of a different religion or none at all sat through it with little say. The morning often unfolded as prayer, then the flag, then the lessons, a fixed order as familiar as the bell. A student today in a public school where teacher-led prayer has long been ruled unconstitutional would be shocked to find religious worship built into the official start of every single day. Number 14. The Pledge of Allegiance was recited every morning, and in 1954 it changed in a way that marked the entire decade. Children stood, faced the flag, placed a hand over the heart, and spoke in unison. Then, in 1954, at the height of the Cold War and the fear of godless communism, Congress added the words "under God." And overnight the recitation took on a new meaning. To pledge was to stand against the enemy, to declare loyalty and faith in the same breath. A child who refused stood out sharply and often paid a social price. A modern student who may treat the pledge as optional or recite it half asleep would be struck by how charged and serious that morning vow once was. Number 13, learning meant recitation and memorization, repeated aloud until the words were burned in. The 1950s classroom did not prize discussion the way schools claim to today. It prized the ability to stand, recite, and recall. Children memorized long poems, the multiplication tables, the capitals of every state, the presidents in order, and recited them on command before the whole class. To stumble was to be embarrassed. To forget was to be drilled again. Knowledge was something poured in and tested by repetition, and the student who could parrot back the most was praised as the brightest. A student now, encouraged to look things up and reason them out, would find the sheer weight of forced memorization both impressive and exhausting. Number 12, the report card graded conduct and deportment as seriously as it graded math. Alongside the marks for reading and arithmetic sat a column for behavior, neatness, punctuality, and obedience. A child could earn top marks in every subject and still be shamed by a poor grade in conduct that followed them home. Does not work well with others. Talks out of turn. These judgments carried real weight in a home where a bad mark could mean punishment. Character was something the school measured and reported, openly and without apology. A modern student whose grades reflect academic work and little else would be surprised to learn that simply being too talkative was once written down as a failing on the official record. Number 11, the dunce cap and the corner turned punishment into public spectacle. A child who failed a lesson or misbehaved might be made to wear a tall, pointed paper cap and sit on a stool facing the corner while the rest of the class looked on. The point was humiliation, plain and deliberate, the belief being that shame would correct what kindness could not. Standing with your nose to the wall, sometimes for an entire afternoon, taught a lesson that had nothing to do with arithmetic. By the 1950s, the practice was fading, but it lingered in many rooms. A student today, raised in an era that warns against shaming children, would be disturbed to see a classmate forced to wear a cap of stupidity in front of everyone. Number 10, writing lines on the chalkboard was the standard sentence for misbehavior. A child who broke a rule was kept after class to fill the board again and again with the same penitent sentence. I will not talk in class. 50 times, 100 times, until the chalk dust coated the sleeve and the wrist ached and the lesson supposedly sank in. It was tedious by design, a punishment measured in repetition and lost playtime. The squeak of chalk in an empty room after the bell was a memory shared by millions. A modern student, more likely to face a conversation or a detention slip, would find the mind-numbing labor of writing the same sentence 100 times a strangely cruel way to fill an afternoon. Number 9, polio emptied the schools and filled every parent with dread. Before the vaccine, the disease struck without warning each summer, leaving some children paralyzed and others gone, and no one knew how it spread. When outbreaks came, schools closed their doors, public pools shut down, and parents kept their children home in terror. A classmate who vanished in September might return in a leg brace or never return at all. The empty desk was a silence everyone understood. The fear shaped the rhythm of the school year itself, the long, anxious wait to see who would come back in the fall. A student today who has likely never heard of a school closing for a paralytic disease that targeted the young would be shaken to learn how ordinary that fear once was. Number 8, the Salk vaccine was given to children right in the school gymnasium, in long lines that made history. When the polio vaccine was declared safe and effective in 1955, the relief was so enormous that church bells rang across the country. Schools became the front line of one of the largest vaccination campaigns the nation had ever seen. Children lined up by the hundreds in the gym, sleeves rolled, to receive the shot from a nurse working down the row. Parents wept with gratitude. The same building that taught arithmetic now delivered the medicine that ended a generation's deepest fear. To a modern student, used to vaccines given quietly at a doctor's office, the image of an entire school gathered in the gym for a mass injection would seem extraordinary. Number 7. Quarantine cards and the fear of contagious disease followed children to and from school. Beyond polio, the era was haunted by measles, mumps, whooping cough, scarlet fever, and diphtheria, and a home with a sick child often had a printed quarantine notice nailed to the front door. A student who fell ill might disappear for weeks, the family confined, the house marked for all to see. The school nurse watched for the telltale rash and sent the suspect child home at once. Sickness was public, visible, and feared in a way that is hard to picture now. A modern student in an age of widespread vaccination would be startled to learn that catching the measles once meant a sign on your door and a town that knew to keep away. Number 6. Smoking was woven into the fabric of the school, even for the people teaching the children. Teachers smoked in the faculty lounge between classes, the air thick and the ashtrays full, and they stepped back into the classroom with the smell still on their clothes. In many high schools, older students were permitted designated smoking areas, and the practice was viewed as a sign of growing maturity rather than a danger. The warnings that would come later were barely beginning to be whispered. A teacher lighting up at the desk while grading papers was an unremarkable sight. A modern student, in a school where tobacco is banned from the entire campus and an adult would be fired for smoking near a child, would find the casual haze of the era genuinely shocking. Number 5. Students were sorted early into tracks that quietly decided their futures. The 1950s school did not pretend that every child was bound for college. Through testing and a teacher's judgment, children were placed onto paths: the academic track for the chosen few, the general or vocational track for the many. And once placed, it was hard to move. A working-class child might be steered toward shop or secretarial classes regardless of talent. The decision was made by adults, often early and rarely explained. Class, race, and gender shaped where you landed as much as ability did. A modern student, told constantly that any door is open with enough effort, would be unsettled to learn how firmly the system once decided, sometimes by the age of 12, how far you would be allowed to go. Number 4. Children with disabilities were simply not in the building at all. There was no special education as we know it, no individualized plans, no ramps, no aids, no legal right to an education at all. A child who was deaf, blind, intellectually disabled, or unable to walk was most often kept at home, sent to a distant institution, or quietly told there was no place for them. The public school was built for the able-bodied and the conforming, and those who did not fit were excluded without ceremony. The federal laws that would guarantee every child the right to learn alongside their peers were still decades away. A modern student who sits beside classmates of every ability as a matter of law and decency would be stunned that an entire population of children was once locked out of the schoolhouse door. Number 3. Corporal punishment was not only legal but expected, and the paddle hung in plain view. The wooden board, sometimes drilled with holes for speed, was a standard tool of the teacher and the principal, and a child sent to the office for talking or lateness might be struck for it without a note home. The threat alone kept rooms silent. A ruler across the knuckles, a switch, the paddle in the hall, these were the accepted machinery of discipline, and parents largely backed the school's right to use them. The fear was the point, and obedience was the goal. A modern student, in a country where most states have banned striking children in school, would be deeply shocked that physical pain was once an ordinary part of an ordinary school day. Number 2, duck and cover drills trained children to survive a nuclear attack, and dog tags marked them in case they did not. At the height of the Cold War, The bell or a teacher's signal sent every child diving under the desk, knees tucked, hands laced over the back of the neck, eyes shut tight against an imagined blast. They were taught a cartoon turtles lesson, as though hiding under a wooden desk could shield them from an atomic bomb. In some cities, children were issued identification dog tags to wear so their bodies could be named after an attack. Fear was constant and quietly enormous. A modern student who practices for fires and storms would be chilled to learn that a generation rehearsed for the end of the world before recess. Number 1. Racial segregation divided the schools so completely that it took the Supreme Court to begin tearing it down. Through the first half of the decade, and for years after in much of the country, black children and white children were forbidden by law from learning in the same building. The schools set aside for black students were starved of funds, packed with hand-me-down books, taught in crumbling rooms, all under the lie that separate could ever be equal. In 1954, in Brown versus Board of Education, the court ruled that it could not, but the walls did not fall overnight. Children walked past hostile crowds under armed guard to enter schools that did not want them. A modern student sitting in a classroom of every background as the most ordinary thing in the world would be shocked to the core that this was once the law of the land. That is our list. From the milk monitor's glass bottles to the deep injustice of segregation, these 30 things show how much a single generation changed and how recent that change really is. Which one shocked you the most? Tell me in the comments and let me know what your parents or grandparents remember from their own school days. Thanks for watching.